Now, it has been a while since the last Spellbook Studies, and it has been a complicated time. I went a little mental, I fell in love with a large worm, I fell apart when that large worm left me for the Worldspire worm, and now, stabilized or not, I'm back for another Spellbook Studies. However, with a need for a change-up in my life, and with a modern-focused set being released in just 2 days' time, I thought it was time we grow as Magic players and branch out to another format besides Commander. This is not going to be our usual setup for Spellbook Studies. Today I'm going to be talking about the merits of a card strictly for the modern format. And with a bunch new cards for that format just over the horizon, you see what I did there, I would like to take you on a deep dive into the card I'm most hyped for, and was actually one of the first to be spoiled on the 20th of May. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Modern Park!
I don't have the rights for this music. I hope this is enough to count as parody.
Now, Thrasta Tempest Roar seems to be the most recent in a new yearly tradition of Wizards of the Coast printing dinosaurs covered in lightning. Thrasta is a legendary 7/7 dinosaur with a mana value of 12 and a casting cost of 10 generic and 2 green mana. This creature has Trample, Haste, Hexproof for the turn that it entered the battlefield, and a new ability called Trample over Planeswalkers. Now, if you don't know what that keyword already means, Trample over Planeswalkers simply means that if Thrasta would deal more damage to a Planeswalker than its current loyalty, the excess damage is dealt to that Planeswalker's controller. A 7/7 for 12 mana. If it weren't for one more line of text, this card would be pretty beyond mediocre. But luckily for this dino, they cost 3 generic mana less to cast for each other spell you've cast this turn. This means if you cast 3 spells in a turn, Thrasta only costs 1 generic and 2 green mana, and if you've cast 4 spells, then they only cast a measly 2 mana. Now when I say 2 mana 7/7, I already start salivating like a waterfall, but then when you add 4 keyword abilities, well, that makes my jaw drop faster than a cheekless zombie on Innistrad. In the right build, Thrasta isn't just a very large, evasive, and hard-to-remove threat, it's also very cheaply costed, which makes it perfect to slot somewhere into Modern. Now, unfortunately, Thrasta, I do need to spend about 5 minutes talking you down, because unfortunately you have very similar energy to everybody's favorite bannable Rotting Heap Hogak. And frankly, if I need to sell you as a card, then I need to assure people that you're not going to instantly get banned and lose them their money. Now, if you aren't familiar with the Hogak deck, then first of all, I need to congratulate you, because your statistical likelihood of having cried at a Grand Prix is severely reduced. The goal of the Hogak deck was effectively to play a 8/8 with Trample on turn 2 with additional 4/3s with Haste consistently. And it did it consistently. Calling this thing competitive is a severe understatement. And even though Thrasta and Hogak seem to hit the same notes, large creature in green, that cheats mana cost, that also has trample, they simply don't stand in the same field, and Thrasta is a far fairer card than Hogak, for 3 reasons I'll get into right now. The first reason is ease of casting. Hogak is cast from permanents you put on the battlefield that stay stationary throughout the game, where Thrasta is cast from triggers on the stack that go away at the end of each turn. The Hogak deck simply needs to play a creature on turn 1 that milled you, do the same for turn 2, and you could fire that Rotting Heap out as quickly as you wanted to. And even if you didn't have the Hogak in hand or in your graveyard to cast it on turn 2, you could wait and still have those pieces there to cast it later. In contrast with Thrasta, you need to wait to have all your pieces in hand, otherwise you might not be able to pull it off. And because Thrasta is cast from triggers on the stack reducing its mana cost, you also don't have the luxury to wait. If you fire off your spells and can't cast Thrasta in the same turn, then you're gonna need 3 or 4 more spells to cast on the next one. Because of that small casting window and its tendency to be slightly more resource intensive, Thrasta is gonna be a lot harder to pull off than the Hogak play. The second major difference between Hogak and Thrasta is consistency. One of the things that made Hogak so powerful was its consistent ability to find Hogak on turn 2. Let's start by looking at one of their common openers. Stitcher Supplier turn 1, Satyr Wayfinder turn 2. With that start, including your opening hand, on the play, you look at the top 15 cards of your library to find Hogak. That's a quarter of your deck, and with 4 copies, you're almost guaranteed to find one by turn 2, and play it the same turn. Not to mention with the London Mulligan, you could almost guarantee a start with this type of velocity. The Thrasta deck story is very different. Because you need your resources the turn you play Thrasta, you're probably going to have to wait a little bit to find that dinosaur. Using the same turn 2 standard and assuming your deck contains Manamorphose and a good number of cantrips, by turn 2 you're probably only going to be able to look at the top 9 or 10 cards of your library. Just by looking at the contrast in those numbers, you can see that your likelihood of playing a turn 2 Thrasta is far less likely than the Houde deck. Sure, it's going to happen sometimes, but you shouldn't bank on it. You should probably assume that turn 3 or 4 play instead. And frankly, that little speed difference is going to be what makes Houde bannable and Thrasta just a decent card. The third difference between Houde and Thrasta mainly is recursion. Considering the two creatures, their size, their CMC, and the relevant removal spells in the modern format make them very difficult to remove. However, a part of what made Houde so powerful is that, in addition to being difficult to remove, he could also just be cast from your graveyard. Because of that constant recursion, Houde is just frankly something that could never leave the battlefield. Now, when we look at Thrasta, they do have a little compensation. They have that temporary hexproof, but it simply just isn't the same power as being able to constantly return to the battlefield. Once Thrasta's gone, it's probably going to stay gone, and that makes Houde broken and Thrasta decent. Now that I've spent a good chunk of time pretty much just explaining the faults of this card, I understand why you might have pause about buying into it. However, I'd just like to remind you that this is in comparison to a card that ravaged the format and required 2 bans to stabilize. Think of Houde and Thrasta like Eldritch Evolution and Birthing Pod. They're both cards with similar effects, but Birthing Pod was obviously more powerful and got banned because of it. But that doesn't mean that Eldritch Evolution didn't find its place in the modern format. And Thrasta, in my mind, can still find a place to be powerful but not broken. Now that I hopefully have proved that a banning won't be wasting your money, we can look into some of the decks that Thrasta might slot well in that are currently being played. For our criteria, we're going to be looking at decks that already want to play as many spells in a single turn as possible, and as a helpful tool, if they are already running Manamorphose, they are probably a candidate for consideration. Our first deck up for Thrasta's scrutiny is It Prowess? Currently one of the most popular decks, Is It Prowess looks to cast as many instants and sorcery spells in a single turn to pump its creatures and swing for a lethal amount of damage as quickly as possible. With Gut Shots, Lava Darts, Mutagenic Growths, and Manamorphoses, this deck already is primed to drop Thrasta's mana cost extremely quickly. Unfortunately, I don't believe Is It Prowess would be looking for a full playset of Thrastas. Rather, it'd be using 2 copies to act as finishers in drawn-out games. Because Thrasta's power is naturally large, has haste, and that temporary hexproof, it's the perfect piece just to sneak out of nowhere when your opponent thinks they have you beat. Since we would need to add an entire new color to this deck to make room for a creature with 2 green pips in its mana cost, you reasonably would likely want to change more to the deck than just adding Thrasta. Dragon's Guard Elite is a creature from Strixhaven whose Magecraft ability gives it permanent prowess in the form of +1/+1 counters similar to Sprite Dragon. And because it also has a low mana value, it might fit perfectly into a Teamer Blitz deck. Now with that green addition, we'll also probably want to take another look at our sideboard, and Veil of Summer is a constant powerhouse when dealing with control and removal heavy decks, and because it cantrips, it also slots perfectly into this deck's plan. For the second deck we're going to be looking to slot Thrasta into, we aren't actually going to be looking at an archetype from the current metagame, but one from recent history. Brought down by a banning and looking for a quick resurgence in the format? You know her! You love her! It's the Arclight Phoenix! Fairly popular in the time of Faithless Looting, Is It Phoenix wasn't popular for just no apparent reason. It was also fairly competitive, but unfortunately since the banning of Faithless Looting, it hasn't really been able to recover its footing. However, perhaps a large, aggressive threat that plays very well into the deck's game plan will be able to breathe some life back into this deck. The goal of your traditional Arclight Phoenix deck is fairly straightforward. It's to dump as many Arclight Phoenixes as you can into the graveyard, and then return all these hasty flyers back to the battlefield to swing for a large amount of evasive damage. While this deck has consistently used 4 copies of Thing in the Ice in the main board as a secondary threat, if we're putting in copies of Thrasta, some will probably have to leave to keep the deck's creature count low, since Arclight Phoenix can't be returned by casting creature spells. Being introduced to this deck as a main win condition, Thrasta will be run as a full playset, cutting 2 copies of Thing in the Ice, as well as 2 of this deck's excessive number of cantrips. The final major change that will probably need to be made to this deck is adding 6 to 8 copies of various rituals, most likely split between Desperate Ritual and Paretic Ritual. Rituals are great for any deck with Thrasta because it makes a much easier time casting her early in the game, and are great in this deck even more so because they can be pushed out quickly to count to 3 to return those Arclight Phoenixes to the battlefield. Truth be told, I believe that this is where Thrasta will truly shine, and if you were paying attention to the first part of this video, you probably already know why. A properly built Temur Phoenix deck and a competent pilot should, by turn 4, be able to replicate the Hogak Vengevine attack plan, playing Thrasta that will simultaneously return 2 Arclight Phoenixes to the battlefield, being able to swing for 15 haste damage in a single turn. Not only will this create a singular attack for a massive amount of damage, it also creates a board state that demands a wrath in response, because basically enough, targeted removal will not be able to save your opponent from this army of hasty attackers. Before moving on, I think there is one card that will most likely need to be part of any Thrasta deck, which is why I would like to highlight it. And since this is modern, I've got to talk about a land. While modern players do love their basic land types, I can't blame y'all. You guys just love fetch lands. Unfortunately, with Thrasta decks, I think there might have to be a little bit of a compromise. The land in question is Firelit Thicket. Guys, you can't fetch for it. I'm sorry. I'm disappointed too. But since most playable rituals only produce red mana, you're gonna need something to convert that into green mana, and Firelit Thicket does it naturally while also only taking a land slot in your deck. Because you can't always guarantee a Manamorphose on the end of a Thrasta chain to produce that 2 green mana, you're simply just gonna need another source that can produce that 2 green mana from red mana. So, you should probably be including at least 2 of these filter lands in any Thrasta deck. So we've been fairly realistic about figuring out where Thrasta might slot in well into Modern, let's have some fun and design something specifically based around the dinosaur. I call this deck Dino DNA. For this deck, we're going to be looking to win with an aggro and overwhelm strategy. We plan on playing a lot of creatures that can recycle their mana to push out Thrasta, and then quickly swing in till we win. The deck's main list can be broken down into 3 sections: Recycle, Impact, and Winners. The Recycle category contains all of our spells that reuse resources, whether it's mana or otherwise. In this category, we have playsets of Birds of Paradise, Burning Tree Emissary, Hidden Herbalist, Wild Cantor, and Manamorphose to recycle our mana. We are also running 2 copies of Eldritch Evolution so that we can recycle some of these vanilla creatures into those that might be more powerful from our next 2 categories. In the Impact category, we have all our cards that are meant to do something to affect the board in a larger way than just providing a creature to swing for damage. In this category, we have playsets of Lightning Bolt and Seasoned Pyromancer, and 2 of each of Beast Whisperer, Bloodbraid Elf, and Chatterstorm. We have designed the deck to grab the creatures from this category with Eldritch Evolution for value or to help us outlast a longer game by creating a more substantial board state. Finally, in the Winner category, we simply have the larger pieces that we have to really push through for a win. There are only 2 different cards in this category. Most obviously, our playset of Thrasta, Tempest Roar, and then 2 copies of Perforos, God of the Forge, to take advantage of our recycling creatures when they can't attack. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into every little piece of this deck, so right now I'm just going to do some broad strokes of the land base and the sideboard. The land base is running a full playset of Wooded Foothills as well as 2 Windswept Heaths to trigger Revolt. In addition, we are also running a forest, a mountain, as well as a playset of Stomping Grounds to be fetched with our fetch lands. And finally, purely for fixing, we have 3 copies of Copperline Gorge and 3 copies of Firelit Thicket. In the sideboard, there are really only a couple of spells that need great explanation. We are running an additional 2 copies of Eldritch Evolution for matches that will rely heavily on us finding Perforos or Beast Whisperer to win. In addition, we also have a copy of Craterhoof Behemoth in the sideboard, which can be found by sacking Thrasta in matches where Thrasta might be a little bit more of a liability after that hexproof is lost. Besides those standout creatures, we are really holding just a variety of utility creatures that can be found using Eldritch Evolution. For instance, we have Fulminator Mage for matches against Tron and other things with fragile land bases. We have Hazoret and Kitchen Finks for aggro mirrors. We have Reclamation Sage to deal with hate artifacts and enchantments. And then the Skoos to hit the graveyard. Now, as with most decks that run Eldritch Evolution, this one has a rather straightforward plan, but when it comes down to the nuances of playing the deck, there will be a discernible power shift between those who understand and know how to pilot the deck and those who don't. I can't make any promise for how this deck will perform, and I understand the hesitance to build it since it costs around $800. However, if you have the means or a good portion of the more expensive cards already, please give it a whirl. It is tons of fun. On that note, I am out of time for today. I hope you found our modern hypothesizing in this Spellbook Studies enjoyable. If you are interested in getting more involved in our community, then feel free to join the Reliquary Tower's Discord server. You might just be able to find somebody to test out your Modern Horizons 2 brews on in our modern channel. Thank you for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content. And leave a comment on this video for what you're excited for the most in Modern's future. If you want to look over the Dino DNA deck list, it will be linked in the description. Please have a good day.